I can hear the wind outside. I hear the rain on my window. I still get unsettled by it. I still wonder whether I should look out and check just to make sure, or whether I should glance up at the ceiling to see if it's leaking, or maybe I should go to the tower room again. But no, I'm not there anymore. The nurses tell me I should find the rain soothing, that many people like to listen to it, that it helps them fall asleep. I only wish I could sleep at all. Everyone is so quick to remind me when I tell them my story, of the facts of science, of reason, of weather patterns and the illogical impossibility of all I have witnessed. They so love to tell me, through well-meaning but patronizing smiles, that I was unwell, that I'm getting better now, and that all was not as it seemed. I only wish I could believe them. I never wanted to tell my story again. I've told it so many times, to so many doctors, to so many psychologists, to every friend, to every member of my family who, at the time, still wished to see me. I've relayed this tale so often that I've started to convince myself that it is just a story. Just some fiction I've made up to cover some awful trauma or psychological maladjustment. But I know that truly, inside the darkest recesses of my logical mind, that it did occur. I know you will believe me. I know you're different from the others. It has become so hard to trust anyone nowadays, but I feel like you have a certain strange familiarity, as if we met long ago. As if we've been friends for a very long time. That is why today, my friend, I will tell you my story. The Rain in the Tower. Written and read by Victor Lockhart. Chapter 1. I was barely 21 when I was told my Uncle William had died. He had fallen from his balcony in the night. The police ultimately reported it to be suicide. I must admit I never knew the man very well while he was alive, but that may be because he never really took the time to know me. As children, we saw him very briefly. We used to visit his estate with my father and play on the spiral staircase with my two sisters, using the curved brass paneling on the walls as mirrors to scare each other by twisting our faces and hiding around the corners. I remember hearing his growling, yet perfectly precise voice echo down the hallway, telling us if we
kept on like that, she'll fall down the stairs and break every bone in your body. Is that what you want?
We'd always quieten down and try to continue playing without alerting him or father while they were having their oh-so-boring adult discussions. Other than when he was shouting at us to stop messing around, he was a very silent man. He gave the air of one who keeps his mouth shut through fear of saying too much. He never seemed to be settled, always looking over his shoulder, checking the garden, checking the clock, the windows, the door, as if he was always expecting a visitor. Yet no one ever came. Our visits were brief, as there was always something he had to do, and he was very busy. And yet every time we visited, I could never understand with what. He was a man born into money, as I am, and as my family have been for generations. My great-great-grandfather was a rather disreputable treasure hunter, traveling to sacred temples and forgotten burial sites, and bringing back enough tomb loot and gold to buy up half of the whole country. Everyone in my family was always so quick to spend the money that historically originated in these unsavory escapades. Yet they were all the quicker to slander those thieves and raiders that got caught, who they saw reported in the news headlines. Our income from the rents of our vast amount of land has kept our ever-growing family in the same familiar comfort as it always has been, since the first back alley dealing was done on a particularly handsome ceremonial dagger. Yet, every visit to my uncle's always ended with various excuses and admissions of being very busy indeed. The visits became more infrequent, but each time we went, I became more and more curious about my uncle and his mysterious home. The building itself held such a dreamlike quality to it, as if its walls were merely a mirage, its doors an illusion. The memories held there simply a far-off fantasy one might have as a child. It was a somewhat dilapidated yet imposing silhouette of a mansion. It consisted of one very tall tower in the center of two separate wings. The tower, in particular, inspired a great fascination and fear in me. I would always ask if my uncle would allow me to go to the very top of it and stand on the balcony. He would always say no, that it was too dangerous, and that a fall from that height would kill you, and I was sure to lose my footing. So we made do with our games on the spiral staircase leading up to it. Sometimes I would sneak up the stairs to the door that stood at the very top and turn the handle. But each time, without fail, it was locked tight. It is a strange truth that one will always become feverishly curious over that he is forbidden to explore. I was always scared to talk to my uncle directly, but on the very brief occasions that I did, it was always about how much I loved the tower. He would never smile at me or begin a conversation. He would merely furrow his thick eyebrows, or a curl of his jet-black hair would fall in his eyes, concealing any readable emotion, and walk back into the study with a glass of some strong-smelling spirit. He never seemed to like me much at all, which is why, not long after the news of his death, I was more surprised than anyone to learn that in his will, he had bequeathed his entire estate and everything in it, down to the last moulding book, to me. I sat in utter astonishment as his lawyer told me this. My father sat beside me, shock and anger written across his face. I can imagine he had expected his only brother to give all he had to him, if anyone. I sat with the papers and the deeds to the house scattered all over my bedroom floor for about a week. I couldn't understand it. Why did he give this all to me? The boy who was always stealing biscuits from the kitchen, always playing on the staircase, always asking too many questions, or trying to break into his study and read all of his notes and books. Why? It both puzzled and unsettled me. Yet, I realized something. No one in my family had expressed much love or interest in his home, in the tower, in its rooms, and in every nook and cranny, but me. He could no doubt have failed to notice how my eyes lit up every time I explored each room, every time we arrived at the front door. When he let us in, I'd never be looking at him. I'd be looking up at the towering structure above me, reflected in my young, daydreaming eyes. Even though I wasn't entirely sure if this was the real reason, it gave me some solace to believe in it. To think that maybe he did pay attention to me, and realized I held those crumbling bricks dear, that I was someone that deserved to inherit it. That is what I comforted myself with. But now, as I sit in this cold hospital room, I am not so sure. Moving in was a rather simple affair. My father, after settling from the initial shock, was pleased for me, and was glad to see me become the new owner of such a grand estate so early in life. It only took the best part of a day to transport all my things over to my new abode, for I was not one for owning more than I needed. I found it vulgar to be attached to so many material objects, as if they were part of one's soul. I was quite content with taking a few suitcases of clothes for every season, and my small collection of books that I spent most of my spare time reading. I would be alone for the first few weeks or so, because I was still to employ staff and search for a reliable butler, which was not a job I wished to rush. This didn't vex me, however. I was quite capable of feeding myself and attending to my ablutions and upkeep while I waited for the right staff to come forward. My uncle never kept any staff, which was always a fascination to me. I'm sure if he could manage this place on his own for many years, a few weeks for me would surely be easy. I turned the key in the lock for the first time and entered that familiarly echoing vestibule. Each step I took filled the room with a sense of eerie loneliness. It wasn't long, however, for my initial uneasiness to slowly shift to that ever-familiar childhood feeling of burning curiosity. It hit me all at once as I breathed in the musty air that I wasn't a boy anymore. I wasn't an unwelcome guest. This time, I had free rein to explore every room of the house. This time, for the first time, the whole estate was mine. No one was going to shout at me. No one was going to tell me it's too dangerous. No one could stop me because, well, I was quite alone and very much within my right to explore my own property, wasn't I? The only rooms I was ever permitted to be in was the living room and the servants' toilet opposite the kitchen. I was never allowed into the study, where my father and my uncle used to talk and drink, or any other room in the house for that matter. The room that I dreamt about, the room I had built so many stories around in my head, was the enigmatic tower room. My whole body seemed to vibrate with excitement and nerves as I climbed the brass-mirrored stairwell, as I so often did as a child. With each step, I felt my mind and body regress into childhood, into the sensations and dreamlike imaginings I had forgotten as I had grown into the young man I was. The wild thoughts that used to explode within my consciousness, the adventures I could have had without even moving a single muscle, charting other worlds, flying through the moonlit sky, diving into the deepest oceans, and fighting the most hideous monsters that defy description, all within the confines of my head. The closer I got to the top, the more thoughts ran through my brain. Well, I'm a grown man. I'm sure I can handle it. But what if he has some wild animal housed? Or it's filled with a poisonous air, or it's contaminated? So I loosened my cravat and used it as a rudimentary mask over my airways, just to be safe. I reached the top of the stairs and extended my hand towards the door handle, flinching once, expecting to hear my uncle's voice coming from the bottom of the stairs. I turned, listened hard, but there was nothing but silence. I was tense, still clutching my cravat over my face. I fully expected the door to be locked, but in one swift and alarming movement, the subject of all my childish dreams and nightmares lay in front of me. I was in a state of disbelief. So many times I had imagined the secrets of this room, what it held. But as I entered and investigated each corner of it, there was only one thing that I could plainly see. It was beautiful. The ceiling was hung with fabrics, gold beads, and lanterns that made me think of a fortune-teller's tent. In the center were pillows and rugs, next to low tables with incense burners and glass tea sets. At the back stood the most exquisitely carved four-poster bed, draped with velvets and silks and decorated with embroidered birds and flowers. The double stained glass doors, which I had only ever seen from outside in the garden, opened to a small balcony. I walked languidly over to it. The whole room felt sleepy, happy, and comfortable. It made you feel as if you never wished to leave at all. I opened the colored glass panels as sunlight streamed in, scattering rainbows and blurry patterns all over the pillow-strewn floor. I stepped out and into the fragrant June air, breathing it deep, gazing out into the sky. I could see a dark cloud not so far away. The whole garden was lit with a pinkish, stormy hue. For a moment, the simple beauty of this vision and the peaceful atmosphere made me forget the horrific tragedy that occurred in this very place I stood only a few weeks ago. The storm clouds were creeping closer, rumbling somewhere far in the distance. I knew then my first night as the owner of this place would be a thunderous one. But just how thunderous, I wasn't to know. Not then, in my blissful ignorance of what lay just ahead of me, like a shadow around a corner. Before I knew it, dark imagery came into my mind's eye. My uncle was standing at the balcony as I stood, his face gaunt and desperate, looking down at the grinning and morbidly welcoming flagstones far below him. What troubles plagued him? What must have been racing through his head? What unhappiness could have led him to such a fate? My head spun, and the ground seemed further away, and yet closer. Closer, ever closer each moment I looked upon it. The stones below me stained themselves redder and redder with the light of the encroaching storm. Or was it blood? I forced my eyes shut and flung my body back into the tower room, lowering myself shyly onto the velvet cushions. I sank down, breathing in the faint scent of burnt-out incense that lingered uncertainly in the air. Although I tried, I could not shake the thoughts of my unfortunate uncle and his terrible end. I felt the uneasiness welling up inside of me and shook my head, trying to focus on breathing, of taking in the comfort of the pillows, of the strangely jarring calmness I seemed to get from that room. It seemed to be a very special place to my uncle. A sudden cold sensation hit me on my cheek, quickly turning warm and sliding down the side of my face. I opened my eyes and saw it was coming from the roof. I sat up, wiping the water off my neck where it had settled. I could hear the patter of rain on the roof, little drops building like the voice of someone who is losing their temper. I heard it rise so fast I could hardly believe it, until the whole tower room became a giant drum, reverberating the noise of each droplet until it became so loud I could hear nothing else, not even my own thoughts. The leaking droplets became more frequent. Larger splashes fell onto the top of my head and into my eyes when I looked up, trying to distinguish the hole it was coming from, but I couldn't see anything. Each time I moved, I seemed to be getting more saturated. Each droplet hit me without fail, despite my attempts to avoid it. I tried to use some of the empty glass teapots and cups to collect any falling rain, and yet I failed to. It was becoming rather absurd, so I gave up, soaked clothing sticking to my skin, and strode out of the tower room to wait out the storm downstairs. The downpour didn't stop all evening. It just seemed to get heavier and heavier and louder with each passing minute. I decided to entertain myself by going through my uncle's expansive library in his study that I was never permitted to enter. I got such a childish thrill from what I still seemed to think was going against the rules. And yet, whose rules were they now? Surely only my own. Reading had become one of my greatest passions. Many a day I spent lost in written words that caused my mind to cascade into passions that carried on well into the night and into my dreams. And yet, I had never amassed such a collection as large or as eclectic as my uncle's. His study was a labyrinth of hidden knowledge and of tangible and delicious atmospheres that I hadn't had the privilege of tasting yet. Books are realms, worlds, inspiration, friends that are familiar or ones you simply haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet. Books hold magic. They produce sparks. Sparks that light the mind and make thoughts dance in elegant yet unpredictable synchronicity, like flying, burning ashes from a raging blaze. Thunder rattled every window as the storm swelled on. I turned the large pages of a copy of The Illustrated Natural History by the Reverend J.G. Wood. Each page was more interesting than the next, each creature more fascinating. I came across the Suriname toad that hatches its young on its back. The eggs are laid, placed by the male onto the female's skin, and sunken into holes, forming underneath a honeycomb-like membrane, only to emerge and crawl out when attaining all of their limbs. The illustration instantly intrigued me, yet filled me with horror. Each tiny frog was emerging from deep holes in the mother's back, perfectly formed and ready to live independently. Some holes lay bare and empty, void of life. The purpose had been fulfilled. Only a husk was left. At that moment, a large gust of wind blew the window of the study wide open, flicking my pages onto that of a oleander hawk moth, and scattering papers and funneling rain into the sheltered warmth of the room. I got up in a start and rushed over to protect what I could of the books that were near the window. Taking each shutter in hand, I went to close it. But something urged me to look up, to look out into the garden. I'm not sure what made me do it, and God, I wish I had not. I wish I had closed the window, in that second sat down and read about how, when regarding Hyla moths, the shape of their bodies, the mode of flight, and even the manner in which they move the abdomen, are so bee and wasp-like that an inexperienced observer would certainly mistake them for some species of Hymenoptera. But I didn't. I raised my head as if by instinct, and through the blur of pulsating rain, I saw a figure, standing detached, quite alone, dressed in a green velvet cloak, utterly soaked to the skin. Blonde hair was stuck down onto their features, so I could not make out a face at all, merely a sodden, matted mess under a hood. It startled me, but I quickly gathered myself and shouted at the figure in the garden. "Are you lost, sir?" The figure gave no acknowledgement. "Madam?" Still, the figure remained inert. "I'm so sorry, are you all right? Can I help you?" Nothing changed. Only I became wetter and wetter as the rain blew into my eyes and all over the books on the table next to me. "I will come out and help you," I uttered loudly over the rain. I promptly slipped on my leather boots and overcoat, remembering only when I had opened the front door to grab the large umbrella that was leaning against the wall. I paced out onto the flagstones, flashes of light silhouetting the shadow of the tower into the garden. Petals and leaves spun and whirled around me as I made my way to where the stranger had been. I called out, unable to see because of the rain in my eyes. "Hello? Do you want to come in and wait out the storm?" I wiped my eyes, holding up my inadequate hand as a shield against the rampageous tempest, the wind flowing into my open mouth, making me breathless as I faced it head on. "Hello?" I shouted louder. But as the search continued, it became clear to me that the stranger had moved on. I faced the study window, as the figure had done not a moment ago. I stood in the two clear footprints that must have belonged to them, and yet they were not there. A gust blew my umbrella with such force it escaped my grasp and flew into the forest beyond the formal gardens. The rain stung my cheeks as I pulled my coat collar over my face and hastily ran back to the front door. The stranger had not made it easy for me to help them, so certainly they were no concern of mine now. I had no idea who this person was, let alone their intentions, and come to think of it, they were trespassing on my property. Maybe it was best they disappeared. Drenched and gasping, I discarded my overcoat and hung it by the mantelpiece. I lit the fire and removed all my damp clothing, putting on a clean linen shirt and trousers. I walked unshod across the paneled floor, the feeling of cold, varnished wood beneath my feet. I made my way over to an armchair in the corner of the room, sunken into the outline of my uncle. I could almost imagine him sitting in it, drinking his spirits in the glass I saw fixed on the table, and reading his... There was a letter. The note lay in a crumpled state, as if it had been held in a very firm grip. I lowered myself into the chair and submerged my wiry body as I picked up the crinkled piece of paper. I unfolded it, smoothing it out on the table with my hand to make it as readable as possible. It read as follows: I regret to inform you that your friend, Mr. Philip Godwin, was found dead atop Old Kirk Hill this morning at 7 o'clock. The cause of his death is unknown, but the physician in charge of examining his body has remarked that there are strange burns all over him. This is all we can say at this time. His family has permitted an autopsy to shed light on this tragic event. My sympathies, Mr. George Hartwell, Chief of Police, Wyvernburn County. I lay back in the armchair and let the words flow over me. It felt cruel to think it, but the thing that had most surprised me was that my uncle had even had a friend outside of the family, or even a friend at all. How and why did the chief of police know to inform him? Why is it I had never heard of this Philip fellow before? I had so many questions with no answers. But it was getting late, and it had felt like an age since coming in through that front door this afternoon. I was tired, and my head was full of so many thoughts. I needed sleep. I had yet to explore and choose my bedroom from the several that there were, but one room seemed to call to me. I checked the fire to make sure my clothes wouldn't set the place ablaze while I rested, and meandered my way up the many spiral steps up to the top of the tower. The brass paneling reflecting my legs in a strange curvature, making them look bent backwards and fragmentary. I opened the door to the tower room once again, breathing in the musty air. I took one step inside the room and lifted my foot in surprise as I realized I had stepped in a large puddle of water. I had quite forgotten the leaking roof earlier. I sighed, gave up hope of sleeping there that night, and tried to see what damage had been done. I walked around, checking surfaces to see what was still dry, and the strangest thing had happened. The rainfall that had fallen through the roof so persistently not 3 hours ago had gathered into a pattern. Almost like a pathway, leading from the door, then to the balcony, and then finally to the bed. I followed the trail, and as I did, I realized more and more acutely that each puddle of water was shaped so strangely like a shoe, like a foot not dissimilar in size to my own. I stood at the edge of the bed. The puddles stopped there. I reached out and touched the velvet covers. They were soaking wet, drenched as if buckets and buckets of water had been poured all over it. But what was more alarming was the shape. the shape of the stain when I stood back to get a better look. It was shaped like a person. I was startled. I thought back to the figure in the garden, how drenched they were. Could they have waited until I opened the front door and made their way indoors? What brought them to this room? Were they still lurking somewhere? I felt immediately conscious of each corner, every panel, all possible hiding places. I felt like 1,000 gawking eyes were on me, as if this ambiguous figure was standing right behind me and breathing hot breath down my neck. A bead of water fell right on the top of my head, and I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me and racing down the spiral staircase, sprinting faster than I ever did in my youth when escaping from my uncle. I made it to the living room and barricaded myself in. Surely the trespasser would not be in there. I sat in the armchair where I had read the note not 10 minutes ago, and I tried to catch my breath. Chapter 2. The next morning, I awoke, crumpled and aching in the chair, each limb feeling rusted and compressed from the abnormal way I had positioned my body in sleep. It took a few moments of fresh consciousness to recall where I was, and the events that had occurred only the day before. Through the lofty window ahead of me, that not so long ago was the frame of horizontal trees, straining hard against powerful gusts, of sheets of heavy downpours, of branches and leaves and all manner of debris flying past, now exhibited a very different scene. The sun's rays touched each leaf, each branch, each flower, transforming all with a brilliant, aureate gleam. I could hear the goldfinches whistling their bright tune, making the world seem whole again, despite the obvious battering of the night before. The sight soothed me more than I can say. The sense of rebirth, the awe-inspiring verdure of nature through such a storm, was enough to make me spring from the leather chair, take the twisted iron poker from the fire, and venture out to confront the possibility of an uninvited lodger. I felt it would be best to prepare for the worst. I didn't know what this person's intentions were towards me, or if they had stolen property, made off with the spoils, and were already miles away. I kicked myself at the thought. How cowardly I am, how utterly weak to hide away and not protect my own property. I tiptoed through each room, carefully searching for any damp footprints that may have given them away. I entered each room like that of a fugitive myself, hiding behind each corner, each piece of furniture, constantly questioning whether I had the physical strength to overcome my unwanted guest, if the situation arose. I imagined the scene, bursting into the presence of this mysterious individual, and knocking them accurately over the head with the metal poker that I held firmly in my sweating hands, sending them crashing down miserably to the floor as I stood triumphant and accomplished above my trespasser. And yet, I knew that would not be the case. I was not, and am not, the tallest nor strongest of men. My sisters grew much taller and much wider than I ever could. I was, to look at least, very much of a dandy. I had never fought another man in my life other than at the fencing club at school, and I can quite plainly say that not for one moment in my comfortable and sheltered existence did I expect to be faced with such an inconvenience as this. To be wandering my property, armed with a twisted and grotesque bulk of iron, in pursuit of an individual who has intruded into my land and into my home with not so much as an inkling as to why or how. These situations are the kind that only one reads about in books and never expects to face in the bright light of reality. And yet there I was, rays of glorious sunlight bathing the pretty hallways in which I trod with ever-increasing tension. The unsettling sense of foreboding rose with each door I gingerly opened, being oh so careful not to make too much noise. Each chamber was as empty as the next, however, apart from the infuriatingly placed taxidermy beasts that made me jump each time I locked eyes with one. I nearly executed a roe deer that was placed ever so maddeningly behind a column. It stared determinedly at me through beaded eyes, as if somehow it acknowledged that even it could beat me in a fair fight. My anxiety and my wavering belief in my somewhat lacking physical prowess made me want to switch from my initial fight response to that of the more fitting flight. What was I but prey in this circumstance? Perhaps I should contact the police. Yes! What a dense and vacuous place my mind has been. Why had I assumed this had to be a solitary and underpowered investigation? The police would come with dogs, with weapons far greater than a fire poker, and with bodies far larger and far stronger than my own. Surely strong enough, at least, to take down a mysterious stranger with unconfirmed and possibly unsavory intentions, if needs be? I took the same path back to where I had come from, and searched for a telephone. It embarrassed me to realize I still had no idea where everything was in my own home. Telephones were nearly always kept somewhere easy to find, weren't they? One would have thought so. I searched all the conventional places you might expect to find one, while keeping my fists still tightly coiled around my one article of defense. And yet even after 3/4 of an hour searching, I came across nothing. I gave up, and truly believed I had exhausted all likely walls, surfaces, and alcoves that a telephone might be, and retired to the study, leaning against the bookshelves, seeing the room from an entirely different aspect from the day before. When I first laid eyes upon the study, I was taken aback by the sheer abundance of volumes I so yearned to explore, diving my nose into each and exposing each page as my mind sunk deeper and deeper into the places they showed me. As I had read, my body rose out of my consciousness, out of self-awareness, out of reality itself, and felt less and less part of the room I stood in. But this room, now I looked at it properly, without the rose-tinted, romantic haze, was hideously messy. My uncle must have spent a lot of time in this place. So much time that he too transcended existence. Got so lost in books, he had become quite blind to the piles of parchment, old volumes, and dust, slowly engulfing him, until he had become quite drowned indeed. Papers and books and writing materials accumulated all around the table, as if it were the center of some giant bird's nest. Books in lofty towers stood like great monoliths. There was only really one way in and one way out. A clear path had been trodden, all the way to the desk and the... My eyes caught a pathway to the back of the room that I hadn't noticed before. It was narrow and so obscured by piled-up publications that it was hard to see when first entering the room. I decided to investigate, being cautious not to topple a particularly gravity-defying tower of novels and stationery, weaving my way through like a jungle explorer, cutting back branches and making my route into uncharted territory. I could tell, however, that the pathway had been charted many times before me. I could see it on the floorboards. The varnish was faded and scuffed, as if it were a great hoof-trodden highway through a dense forest. I followed the historical footsteps, picturing my uncle taking the same journey before me, ducking under the hanging lamp as I did now, touching the glass of the cabinet that leered uncomfortably close by as I turned past the dog-eared and broken-spined copy of The City of Dream by Robert Buchanan. Almost as if his hand had placed itself countless times in the same way as I had placed mine. I made the final turn, compressing myself between two sizable pillars of long-forgotten dusty tomes, and I came to a cabinet. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about it, nothing that made you immediately understand the well-worn road to its ultimate revelation. What treasure was this? I thought, reaching for the tarnished brass handle. It opened in one motion, and it creaked like the lid of a wooden coffin. Inside, placed solitarily, standing proud and regal like an icon on an altar, was a brass telephone. It had ornate engravings on its base of flowers and leaves, and within the rotary dial there was an enameled painting. It was of a man dressed in royal regalia, arm aloft and frozen in time, mid-gallop upon a bay horse. The colors were vibrant and fresh, not a speck of dust or stain to be seen, although the brass on the handle of the receiver was tarnished and worn, the outline of a handprint almost visible. I had found what I was looking for, and yet I couldn't help but feel a sense of vague uneasiness about using this hidden relic. It felt sacred, secret somehow. It felt hidden for a reason. Yet I could find no other means of contacting the outside world, save a very long ride into town, and the idea of that did not thrill me. I resolved to dial the police. I did so slowly, apprehensively, and almost ritualistically, turning the dial and finally holding the earpiece up to my face, expectantly clearing my throat, and shuffling my whole posture forward and then back, restlessly. There was no ring, no noise at all. Just a worrying silence. I thought perhaps I must have dialed wrong, so I tried again. This time a little faster. I still could have had an intruder in my home, and I didn't desire to waste any time. But yet again, my ears were greeted by naught but the sound of abnormal inactivity. A rush of anxiety peaked in my head, rising from my toes. I put down the receiver and picked at my fingers, trying to decide on what I could do. Perhaps the line was broken, I thought, and I picked up the phone, tracing the cable back into the wall with my fingers. I looked closer. The paint had worn away more on some of the numbers than others. The 6, the 4, the 3, the 9, and most noticeably, the 0, which had almost faded from existence. This phone had been used a lot, no doubt, and yet why was it so concealed? Curiosity burned in my mind. I wanted to understand it. I dialed the numbers of my family, of my friends, of anyone I felt might be able to help in my predicament, and yet the dead silence was the only solace I was offered by the cold and unfriendly metal receiver. Surely my uncle must have kept a phone book, a list of contacts, or at least a record of the numbers he had dialed on this heavily worn phone. I searched the cupboards that enveloped the phone cabinet, raiding through each drawer and shelf I could see, and yet I discovered nothing. I ran my hands through my hair and looked around in desperate indecision. I had no idea what to do, but I knew it was pointless making myself ill over such a thing. There had to be something else I could do. I closed the door on the blasted phone and turned on my heel, making my way back through the jungle of paper and ink I had journeyed through, and sat down miserably in the leather chair by the desk. I had barely made contact with the seat when my silent resolve was shocked into sudden alertness. A brisk and determined rapping sounded from the front door, like the tapping of a very hungry woodpecker. I rose out of the chair in a single movement, adrenaline racing through each limb and down to the very ends of my fingers. I pressed my clammy hands down onto unwilling pages of some open books, and for a moment I could do nothing but freeze. I listened, wondering if my nervous mind had simply imagined the knocking. For who would be calling me at this time? Not many people even knew I had moved in, save my close family. And they certainly weren't the type to swing by unannounced. The knocking came again. Louder this time. More impatient. I sprung forward, pacing with a sort of determined yet terrified stride, as one may do as a child when being caught in a place you shouldn't be. As I made my way closer to the door, I felt the hairs stand up on the back of my neck, exposed in the hallway with so many doors. Doors that a certain intruder could burst out of at any second. The knocking continued, causing my heart to follow its erratic and irrepressible rhythm. I placed my hand on the latch and the handle, without moving them, and questioned if I should prepare myself for the unexpected. Surely anyone who knocks has an element of politeness to them. If they meant harm, they probably wouldn't have bothered. They would have come in through the window or beaten down the door to get inside. I undid the lock and moved my hand protectively down towards one of my uncle's old hunting canes in the umbrella stand, and grasped it where it stood, holding it by my side out of sight. Then, in one swift moment of powerful inspiration, I flung open the door. Upon taking the first swift glimpse of the source of the knocking, my purchase on the cane slackened, languished entirely, in fact, and it came crashing, unceremoniously, and very rudely, onto the echoing stone floor. A small noise, like that of a startled mouse, peeped into existence as the cane settled at my feet. But before I could understand who I was standing in front of, introduce myself or give an apology, a demure, white-gloved hand was offering me back the carved wooden interruption which I had so anxiously held not moments ago. I took it automatically, saying nothing but, "Sorry, so sorry about that," or words to that effect, and held it weakly and ashamedly in my right hand. "I'm so sorry to disturb you, Mr." The voice stopped, and awaited a continuation from me. "Oh, yes, hello. I'm Highmore, Toby Highmore, William Highmore's nephew. I just moved in. Inherited the place. I'm so sorry for my—" I gestured vaguely to the cane, and what I assumed was my rather disheveled appearance. "No, not at all," the voice replied, in a heightened yet understanding tone. "I hope everything is all right, Mr. Highmore." I breathed a few slow, calming breaths, suddenly realizing I was not in the presence of anyone wishing me harm, and allowed my social niceties to catch up with me, while still being dreadfully aware of my still unresolved predicament I had going on within the confines of my abode. "Nothing to worry about," I chuckled nervously. "And who do I have the pleasure of addressing?" I placed the bottom of the cane at my side and leant on it, trying to style myself in a theatrical facade of a relaxed and cool-headed disposition. "I am Chataway, Miss Adelia Chataway. I live at Blanche Manor across the lake. I heard of your uncle's unfortunate passing, and I came to pay my respects, and to welcome you and your family to Wyvernburn." Now, at this moment, I was faced with a most unusual predicament. Do I do the socially proper thing and invite the lady inside and offer her some tea? Do I pretend everything is fine? Invite a perfectly innocent and unsuspecting individual into my home, the home of a man who is the unwilling host to an anonymous and unwanted guest, to allow her to sit, possibly alone for some time, for who else was going to make the tea, while being subjected to my foolish attempts to cover up my ever-rising anxiety over the situation? Surely she would notice something was up. No, I could not let her in. I wouldn't. I'll make some excuse. Tell her I have a terrible rat problem. Yes, that ought to work, I thought. It was only after I came back into consciousness, after following my trail of thought over the matter, that I realized she had already entered of her own accord, probably moving past me while I dazed into nothingness, and was admiring the portraits in the hallway as if it were a public gallery. Beautiful work. Do you know the artist? I spun on my heel as I heard her speak, more in alarm than anything, and rushed to her side, looking frantically down each end of the hall with cane still in hand. She didn't turn to look at me, or even seem to notice my uneasy state. She merely kept focusing on the canvas that had arrested her concentration. No, I don't. Look, I have a terrible rat problem. It came out of my mouth so awkwardly, and almost comically, that I nearly laughed out loud out of sheer nervous energy. Rats? She replied, turning her head towards me swiftly. Yet her expression was not what I expected. If anything, her face resembled that of a child to whom I had just told there was cake in the pantry just for them, and they didn't even need to eat dinner first. My brows furrowed in bewilderment, and my ears tuned out to her continuation as she began to roll up her sleeves and mention something about having lots of experience. The next thing I knew, she was looking at me expectantly, as if she had just asked a question, but I hadn't heard it. I'm sorry, what did you say? I said finally, unwelcome images of the intruder clubbing Miss Chataway over the head. Where are the lovely little beasts? She answered, not at all put out by being asked to repeat what she had said. Oh, well, that's just it. I don't know. Look, I really don't think it's safe for you to be here. Nonsense, she interrupted, patting me quite hard on the shoulder with her small gloved hand that I almost lost my footing. I've dealt with many a rat infestation before, she announced matter-of-factly, and promptly made a sharp noise, raising her finger. Completely humanely, of course. No violence is necessary. I stood dumbfounded, and rattled my brain as to what I should say next. But nothing happened. I just stared blankly. Miss Chataway looked at me curiously. Mr. Highmore, are you really all right? You look extremely pale. Oh. Then a strange expression came over her face. Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Highmore. She went quiet and started to mumble, a tinge of guilt in her voice. I get carried away sometimes. It's only just occurred to me you haven't even invited me in. Oh dear. I do apologize. She began to roll down her sleeves, and she looked at the floor as if it might offer some comfort. My mind switched into action. Even though I didn't want to put Miss Chataway in danger, the idea of being the only one aware of my current predicament was too much to bear any longer. Miss Chataway, may I confide in you? I said, maybe a bit too quickly and loudly, that it gave Miss Chataway a start. Her eyes shot up, the promise of a secret, clearly one that was a thrilling idea to the lady, and she paused in unfolding a portion of her sleeve. Of course, Mr. Highmore. What seems to be the matter? She showed no sign of nervous energy, just genuine concern and interest. It baffled me. She was in a strange house with a very strange man that had done nothing but sweat profusely, carry a hunting cane tightly in his hand, and then ask if he can tell her a secret. Yet she acted as if she were at a casual afternoon tea party with an old friend. I prepared my words as carefully as I could. Last night, I believe an intruder made their way into these walls, but I've been unable to find them. I have reason to believe they may still be here, and I am quite afraid. I couldn't phone the police because the phone isn't working, and I am at a loss as to what to do. Miss Chataway's expression did not change as she listened intently to my story. But then, when I had finished, her eyes widened and her eyebrows raised, followed by a soft, closed-mouth smile that eventually opened, showing her pearly white teeth, and grinned with what I can only say was pure delight. This is amazing. Oh, it's just like the tales, the break-in, the mystery, the investigation. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Mr. Highmore, there is no need to be afraid, she said in a firm yet comforting way, and took hold of each of my arms with a surprisingly tight grip. We will find this intruder, capture them, and all will be well. It will be an adventure. I had concluded that either Miss Chataway was quite mad indeed, or perhaps she was more of what I wished to be. Clearly very brave. Braver than I was. Or was it foolish? Either way, I could see she was intent on helping, no matter if I was infested with rats or with mysterious trespassers. I admire your enthusiasm, Miss Chataway, but how exactly are we going to find them? She released my arms from her grasp and tilted her head back, straightening up and raising her finger in an overly theatrical way. With good old detective work, Mr. Highmore. How else? The next thing I knew, I was guiding a very chipper Miss Chataway up the spiral staircase, the iron poker now gracing her hands, and the cane still in mine. My new companion scrambled hastily up each step, more quickly than it was possible for me. A few times I lost sight of her, only hearing the shuffling of skirts and clicking of heels. By the time I had reached the top of the tower, I was quite exhausted. Miss Chataway stood by the door with wide-eyed wonder, trying to look through the keyhole at what lay beyond. Not a bead of sweat to be seen, or a gasping breath to be heard. "Mr. Highmore, may I have permission to enter?" she shouted back to me, eyes still glued to the keyhole, as if she couldn't tear herself away. I took the final turn up the steps to face her. "Yes," I replied nonsensically. I was so out of breath that was the best my mouth could do. Luckily, Miss Chataway needed no translation. She burst in through the door, iron poker in hand and eyes darting in every direction. The room looked the same as it had been. Nothing had been moved. One thing that stood out, however, was that the footprint puddles had completely gone. I sunk down onto my hands and knees to feel the floor for dampness, but it was completely bone dry. It couldn't be. It had been completely saturated last night. It never would have dried in such a short time and left no mark. An odd feeling rose from the pit of my stomach. I hadn't dreamt it, had I? Had I fallen asleep in my books and merely dreamt all of this? Am I still dreaming? I internally slapped myself across the face. No, it's not possible. It happened. I'm sure it did. Miss Chataway was picking up a glass teapot, turning it upside down and looking down the spout as if it were a telescope. I had another thought. The bed. Surely the bed would still be wet. I jolted my body forward, not even allowing my legs to fully unfold in a standing position, and strode in an almost comical, semi-recumbent half-run, throwing myself onto the bed and pressing my hands into the heavy sheets. Dry. As dry as if it had been hung by the fire all night. My fingers tingled and I felt the tower room spin. Miss Chataway's mumbled ramblings of fingerprints and evidence flew past my ears as if I were underwater. I lowered myself sheepishly onto the covers and tried to think of a logical explanation. I have often observed that unexplained things happen in lonely places. They see a singular child, a quiet night, a dark hallway, and when they feel the time is right, they take their stage. Often, when these odd occurrences take place, it is witnessed only by one unlucky viewer. The viewer is most commonly an infant. In fear, they will run to their elders and tell of something lingering in the cupboard, of something hiding under the bed, of something creeping just out of sight. The elder will comfort them. Tell them it was just a dream. Just an overactive imagination. Yet the child knows what they saw. Even they know what it is to dream and what it is to experience reality. Why then must their visions be denied? Why must their insights into things misunderstood be swept under the carpet? When these odd experiences are had when one is grown into adulthood, well, then surely they are mad, gone round the bend, lost their minds. No smile of comfort is given by any elders, no. Merely very serious faces and lots of paperwork. Why must we few who have seen be made to feel as if we are mad? Why not everyone else? Why must we be contained to our beds and told we are to get better when we know the truth? How can I show these people that what I saw was real? The figure in the rain. The thunder struck and woke me from what must have been a deep sleep. I was alone in the room. Miss Chataway was nowhere to be seen, and the sun was lower in the sky. I started from the bed and dashed down the tower steps into the hallway. "Miss Chataway?" I erupted. "Miss Chataway, where are you?" I heard a soft muffle through the study door. "Oh my God," I thought I heard her say. What could have happened? I burst through the door, my face flushed from the adrenaline of the moment. Miss Chataway was there, merely sitting in the study chair, quite happily, flicking through the pages of one of my uncle's many biology books. She had yet to even notice my entrance, as loud and as rude as it had been. I had no idea it worked like that. She looked up with a curious and slightly embarrassed look, probably noticing the draft from the door before she noticed me. "Oh, Mr. Highmore, I had thought you to still be asleep." I stood there in disbelief. Asleep? I thought to myself. I crumpled myself like an old piece of paper into a feverish faint. That is hardly the peaceful descent into dreamland one hopes for. Surely she had not thought that a man suddenly falling so deeply out of consciousness was a normal thing. I could have had an episode that needed immediate attention. Was this woman quite well? I swallowed my reaction, my eye slightly twitching. I felt ill. I wasn't myself. I'm still not. I piped up softly. I took my gripped hand finally off the doorframe and dabbed my dripping forehead with my sleeve. She stood up, suddenly realizing her mistake. "Mr. Highmore, I am so sorry. I get carried away, you see. Sometimes I don't see what others may do so easily." Her eyes moved down to the floor, giving the impression of a child who knows they have behaved badly. "If only I'd known, I would have made sure you were all right. I don't mean to be." Her eyes moved up to meet mine, but darted suddenly to my right. "Mean to be what, Miss Chataway?" Her eyes were fixed, just a small distance to my right-hand side, a quizzical expression beginning on her face. "Mr. Highmore, I was led to believe you lived alone." I felt a tingle at the back of my neck, and a cold sensation played upon my whole body. Clearing my throat pathetically, I answered her plainly. "I do live alone." "I see," she said matter-of-factly, her eyes still fixed in that same place. Never had I been so terrified. so frozen in place. I could sense something. It felt cold, damp. It smelled like rain on hot stone slabs, like burning. "I say, good sir, it is very rude not to introduce yourself to a lady." No sooner had she uttered those incongruous words than the paralyzing sound of heavy footsteps rushed away from my side. I turned instinctively as the commotion occurred, and saw nothing but dripping wet footprints leading down the darkening hallway. It had been so near, so incredibly near, so near in fact that my right sleeve felt ever so slightly damp. Miss Chataway leapt up from the table. She grabbed my arm in a tight grip, guiding me unwillingly in the direction of the watery path. I had no time to think, let alone speak, as I was dragged, half-dazed, through the maze of my own hallways. "Miss Chataway," I said, as if dreaming, "what are you doing? This doesn't seem wise to me." "Oh, Mr. Highmore, don't you understand? This man means us no harm. Why else do you think he's running away? If he had intended to hurt or kill you, he would have done so already. He had a very easy opportunity back then when he was standing beside you." "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" I interjected, feeling a cold sensation all over again. "I really had no intention of making you feel worse or better. I am simply telling the truth." She stopped suddenly, listening in the silence. I opened my mouth to speak, but she silenced me with a single gloved finger to her lips. I obliged reluctantly, and tried weakly to get my arm free of her tight grasp. But she was strong, very strong, and I really wasn't. I could hear nothing. Had it finally stopped? Then we heard a slam, both of us jumping at the sound. And somehow, we both knew where it had come from. It is a strange truth that when you become accustomed to a house, you learn its noises and what they mean. A squeaky garden gate, a drip in the attic, a window sliding down, a floorboard creaking upstairs, or, in this instance, the door to the tower room slamming. That door was very different from the rest. It had ironwork shoddily fixed that made a secondary clink when the door shut. The momentum of the door made it bounce off the wood and settle after the impact, making its signature noise. I had not lived here long, and yet somehow this noise was known to me. Perhaps I had heard it in my childhood. Who was to say? Rain pattered gently on the window panes, mockingly, as Miss Chataway stood opposite me in unspoken understanding. The door to the tower room had been slammed, and in that same terrible instant, we both knew that we had to investigate. Chapter 3. The walk up those stairs filled me with more dread than they ever had. Each step felt like a nail in a coffin, a flirtation with death, the boards groaning under my unsteady feet. Miss Chataway was 3 steps ahead. She could have been waltzing through a summer meadow for all the spring and delight in her step, and without wasting a moment to even breathe, she pushed the tower room door wide open. What happened in that moment will forever be etched upon my mind. My eyes wavered from my feet to the shoes of Miss Chataway, and then finally to the swiftly moving shadow on the back wall of the room. It galloped in an unsettling, graceless way, tripping once and allowing its withered limbs to bend in unnatural directions. It threw open the stained glass doors and, making no noise or giving any kind of hesitation, threw itself off the tower room balcony. Miss Chataway ran after the figure, onto the balcony, and stood as still as a pointer. She turned on her heel towards me, with an expression of calm intent. and then she merely uttered the words. He needs help. She pushed past me, no discernible emotion readable on her face, skirts bustling past the banisters. I fell to my knees in shock, the vision of what I had just seen filling my already weakened mind. I tried to slow my breathing. Existential dread passed coldly through my body. I felt like I might lose my grip on reality altogether if I hadn't spared a moment to listen to the sound of clacking heeled boots sounding through the spiral staircase. The thought of such a kind, if naive, lady putting herself in harm's way was too troubling to think about. No, I had to follow. I needed to. Don't you understand? I felt obligation, responsibility. At least that's what I told myself as I sped down the stairs, adrenaline coursing fast into my body, making me run faster than I ever knew that I could. Thunder struck as loudly as if it was coming from the very center of the house. I darted through the hallway into the front door, which lay open like a gaping mouth, drooling heavy rain inside and slicking the smooth white marble. Small footprints had dirtied the puddle in little blotches, like ink dropped in milk. Miss Chataway must have ventured outside. Why didn't she wait? What had possessed her to follow this shadow all on her own? Why did it have to happen to her? I could see her kneeling down on the slabs below the tower balcony, rain bouncing off her shoulders and dripping down her back. Smoke dissipated around her, and a black shadow stained the slabs. Her head hung low, and then lower, and lower until she fell face down in a silken heap. Before I knew it, I was at her side, turning her over onto her back and shielding her from the raging storm. She was warm, very warm. Her face was red and burned. I felt her pulse. She was still alive. She opened her eyes slowly, gazing somewhere beyond me, somewhere I just could not reach. She seemed different, as if her mind was clouded with visions of something terrible. She was so still, as if petrified. She didn't even shiver. He needs help, she repeated, just as before, like a needle on a record, the same cadence, the same tone, as she spoke in the tower room. Who needs help? I responded, tears welling up from the center of my chest. Her eyes lazily turned away from me, and I followed them. Standing on the pathway was a figure. Cloaked, curls of unruly hair blowing underneath the hood, concealing any sign of a face. I gently propped Miss Chataway up so she could get to her feet, keeping my eyes firmly fixed on the figure who leered 10 paces away from us both. "What do you want?" I shouted, terrified, feeling a rare burst of protective masculine energy. The figure merely stood there, as still as a statue, the wind raging around them, and billowing the cloth of their coat like black sails in a storm. I felt the frustration inside me build. I couldn't stand this mystery any longer. I gently parted myself from Miss Chataway, making sure she could stand on her own. I don't know what made me do it, but I started walking towards this figure, as if I were a man of considerable strength and valor. I took a few uneasy steps closer. 5 paces now. I could smell something. Burning hair. Cooking meat. I saw the feet of the figure shuffle impatiently in the gravel, and with a resounding crack of thunder, the figure turned on their heels and ran. ran just like you or I, down the road, and it began to shout excitedly.
You said you'd come. Quick, let's go. Now while we still can.
My head spun. This was not what I had expected. It felt all wrong. Surely this was a trap. I turned to Miss Chataway, who was resting quietly under the porch. I wish I'd gone back to join her. I wish I'd let that golden-haired thing run all on its own into the fields beyond. I ran, confused more than ever, rain soaking into my skin through my cotton shirt.
Stop running away. I have questions. Why are you here? What do you want?
I paused for breath, taking a moment to glance back at Miss Chataway, who stumbled back into the relative safety of the house, defeated and soaked to the skin.
And what have you done to my friend?
I was running out of breath, and the words came out so quietly in the pouring rain, even though it hurt my throat to shout them. I could hear him laughing like a school child, and for some reason it angered me. I kept up the chase, as if he were a deer and I, a hunter, following him, wishing he would fall, so I could put a face to all this madness. I needed to prove this had a logical explanation. I've just been had, is all. I've been pranked, played with. What a sick joke this all was. We ran through a ploughed field. I must have fallen a few times, but I can't remember. All I remember is watching that black outline in the blinding rain, dashing in front of me towards the hill. Old Kirk Hill. The kirk was in ruins, the outline of its gable end still visible, but the bell tower long gone. The figure stumbled finally on the brow of the hill, falling onto his knees. I caught up, pain stabbing through my body from exhaustion, mud covered and drenched in sweat and rain, water dripping from the top of my head down to the bridge of my nose. I tried to speak, but I couldn't. I merely choked and gasped in the rain and stared down at the shadow who had led me here. The figure, still hunched over the ground, took down the black hood that shrouded him, golden tresses tumbling to the shoulders. He turned, and then I saw his face for the first time. He couldn't have been older than 30. Eyes like black beads, and a face that reminded me of an angel that Botticelli may have painted. He did not look at me. His eyes reddened, as if he were crying. But how could I be sure in all that rain? He reached a hand in front of him, slowly grasping at something in the distance. I followed his eye line. It was the tower. He clasped his hand gently in midair, holding it there for some time.
I'm so glad you came. I'm so glad that we can run away like we planned.
I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, dumbfounded. He rose from his knees and looked deeply into my eyes. A feeling of increasing unease filled my chest. If I had had more breath in me, I'm sure I would have done something, made a run for it, defended myself. I'm not even sure what. The golden-haired man smiled lovingly at me as his gaze fixed me into place in the middle of that old kirk ruin. I could not move. I felt transfixed, enchanted even. I forgot my anger, my fear, even my sadness. He reached out towards me and ran his fingers through my sopping wet hair.
Oh, William, I love you.
William? Oh my God, no. Before I knew it, his lips were locked on mine. Clouds seemed to gather like a great tornado, the wind whipping up like nothing I had ever experienced before.
I could smell burning hair, burning flesh. I could hear a scream, a terrible scream. I blinked and saw two burning eyes staring back at me. I saw things. I saw my uncle and the golden-haired man. I saw them run up the stairs, lock the tower room door. I saw them drink tea and laugh and kiss and dance around in the colored light through the stained glass panes. I saw my uncle smile for the first time in my life. I heard him say he loved him, the golden-haired man. I saw my uncle creep through his study towards the cabinet, where he kept the phone. He dialed. Philip, I love you, the golden-haired man. They spoke for hours. They spoke of the future, of running away. I saw them argue. I saw Philip cry, and my uncle slap him across the face. I heard my uncle tell Philip it was wrong what they did. Wrong, and it would always need to be hidden. They couldn't live the life he had spoken of. Philip told him he was leaving. He could come with him. They could start a new life together, a life away from judgmental eyes, from family, and from questions. I saw the golden-haired man pack his bags, smiling, hopeful eyes staring out of his window. I saw my uncle pacing in front of his fireplace. I saw letters in his hands, and I saw them burn. I saw Philip step out of his door. I saw the rain begin to fall on his shoulders, but he didn't frown. I saw my uncle pour himself a glass of whiskey. I saw him sit in his old leather chair. I saw Philip walk through the fields towards Old Kirk Hill. Thunder rumbling not so far away. I saw my uncle light his pipe. I saw him down 3 glasses of his favorite malt. I saw Philip wait, rain beginning to soak through his clothes. I saw my uncle smoke and clear his throat. I saw Philip wait. I saw my uncle thumbing through pages and pouring himself more to drink. I saw Philip wait. I saw my uncle's eyes red with drunkenness. I saw Philip. I saw a lightning strike. I saw Philip dead. They say I was lucky. They say that hardly anyone can make a full recovery from such an ordeal. Being struck by lightning. That's a 300,000 to 1 chance, they say. Surviving it is new science. Yet here I am. And so is Miss Chataway. Yes, she lived. However, I am not permitted to be near her, or even speak to her again, on the account of the suspicion that I have caused her harm. They say she is having a hard time remembering what happened on that fateful day. I wish I had such luck. I can remember it all, clear as day. Clear as I'm seeing you. In some dark way, I wish it had killed me. Or at least wiped the memories from my mind. That place is haunted. Haunted by the memory of a love that could not be. I understand why this spirit could not rest. Why my uncle died the way he did. Why he gave the house to me. He knew it was a lost cause. He had been driven to madness by the haunting of his dead lover. The lover he had killed by his abandonment and a cruel twist of bad luck and bad weather. Philip's soul had been planted like ivy in that place. He lay rooted under the slabs, twisted around every tree and growing in every crack, in every brick, all the way up to the top of the tower.
and like ivy he could tear it all down. To love with such a love leaves marks on this world that nothing can erase. It stains a place like a storm, stains the sky red, red like fire and blood. So, there you have it, my friend. The story that no one believes, and the one I am cursed to remember. I wish I could make them all understand what it feels like to touch death, to be kissed by it, and to feel the rain in the tower. Thank you so much for listening today. This is an original work which I have been nervous to share. So if you liked it, please make sure to comment your thoughts and leave a like. If you like what I do, please consider supporting me on my Ko-fi. To enhance the immersion and overall listener experience, I have switched off monetization on this particular video. So every donation, if you do choose to give one, would be greatly appreciated. But for now, thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you very soon.